Let 'em Go Barefoot is a podcast that dives into all things parenting and education through the lens of mindful awareness. Conversations aim to bring forward patterns, beliefs, and attitudes that shape our expectations and ideas about what it means to raise healthy children. With a blend of science, ancient wisdom, and intuition, we will explore ways to support, nurture, and connect with our growing children while also nurturing and expanding ourselves. I am grateful you are here. Welcome back, everyone, to the Let 'em Go Barefoot podcast. Today, I am speaking to Ruth. And Ruth, I forgot to double check. Is your last name Rinaldi? Is that how you say it?
I say Rinaldi, but I'm not that
Rinaldi.
fussy.
Okay, Ruth Rinaldi, and she is on Instagram at Joyful Maths Home Ed. And I asked Ruth to come on because I found her on Instagram posting about math. And I thought, oh my gosh, I have to get her on because this is an amazing topic to dive into through the lens of unschooling. And it's an area that has been probably one of the biggest questions I've had as an unschooling parent. And to the point where it's almost comical. When we first started homeschooling, one of the questions I got when my son was, I think he was like 7 or 8, and it was, well, what about high school? What about high school math? And I was like, he's 8. We don't care about that yet. And so I asked Ruth to come on because I know she's had experience in high school math and is also has young kids herself. So welcome, Ruth. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, yeah, it's lovely to be here too.
Tell us a little bit about your background. Like, how did you get into math and what inspired you to create an Instagram account?
Absolutely. So if I go right the way back, in school, I didn't click that I was quite good at maths until later on in school. Probably it would be high school. It's in America and Canada and other countries, but in England we do just primary school and secondary school. So it was partway through secondary school that I clicked that I was okay at it, and that I had a really good teacher. That was one big factor. Somebody that would just answer lots of questions and really go in deep with things, but also a really good friendship group. And I really believe in community and working together being a big part of enjoyment in maths.
Mm-hmm.
I actually ended up doing a lot of maths at A level, which for us is 16 to 18 traditionally. Although one thing I do have to point out is you can take any of these qualifications at any point in your life. It's just they're traditionally done at these ages. And I actually ended up going on to do a degree in maths, not intentionally. It was just what I was doing well at. And like I said, I'd formed a really good friendship group. And the same happened for me at university. Got a really solid friendship group around maths. And I'm still very, very close with those people nowadays, which is insane. That was like half my lifetime ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I went on to do teaching because although really loved doing the maths, I love communicating more than anything. My PGCE, which was my qualification in teaching, I really loved the theory side and I liked being in a classroom, but teaching versus the theory turned out to be wildly different, and that threw me. It was a huge learning curve.
Mm-hmm.
It was not a natural space for me at all. I had to learn how to be lots of things that I wasn't, and I stuck at it for 11 years, and that included having 2 children in that time. And I eventually became head of a maths department in a secondary school, and then the pandemic hit, and during that I found it really, really stressful managing my department. I found it really stressful having 2 young children at home, and I saw my son, who was going to preschool, so he hadn't started school, but I'd noticed that he was thriving when we had him at home all the time, and that he was very different to what he'd been when we didn't have him at home all the time, which started cogs turning in my head, started me noticing when I went back to school how we were treating some of the children, particularly the ones that were aged around 15, 16, that were about to take a big set of exams in England that are called GCSEs. They're happening at this time of year in June. And how stressed a lot of them were, how their mental health wasn't a priority. It was
Mm,
talked about, but it wasn't acted upon. And eventually it got to a point where I was just like, I can't protect these people, but I can't do it to them anymore. I can't be complicit in this.
mm,
So we decided, me and my husband, that I would take a sabbatical to trial out home education, and that's been 3 years now, and we absolutely love it.
yeah.
But I was the main earner in our household, so we had to be creative with that. So I started doing tutoring in the evenings, which I do love. I love the one-on-one work. But it's still very much working within and for the school system, which I have big issues with. And I love supporting these people, but I don't necessarily love the maths in it. And I created Joyful Maths because I wanted to celebrate a subject that I think is really diverse and beautiful and enjoyable. But I don't think it's presented very well in schools. So
Mm,
that's my whole ethos for
yeah.
Joyful Maths.
Well, that's an amazing background, and it obviously gives you insight that not everyone has, that, it's a very clear trajectory to where you are now. There's a
Mhm.
couple of things you said that stood out. One is that you noticed, the noticing with the kids, with your own child, and then also what you noticed with the students. And the other thing was that teaching, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you were saying that the teaching the math itself was not a natural space for you, that you noticed that this just wasn't something that worked with you. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that, about what you meant by it not really being a natural space for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Two big parts of it. One was delivering maths in a way that didn't feel great because I was getting people to memorize things, and the whole aim of it was to get them through exams.
Mm,
Now, ideally, that would be through methods of exploring and problem solving. But the reality was that you could do that as long as you dedicated a significant amount of outside of school time to it, which I found absolutely impossible once I had children. There was no way I could be the mother I wanted to be and put all that extra time into, because you have such a huge timetable. Um, and also, the content in the exams is big, it's
mhm.
huge. And just to get through the content in time, it's really, really challenging to do that. But the other side is, I suppose it could be summed up as behavioural management. I can now reflect on it as a home educator that these children weren't behaving poorly, they were acting in an appropriate way for them in a situation that they found difficult and challenging a lot of the time.
Mhm.
But when your priority is, and I'll be honest, it was my priority because this is prior to reflecting on it in that way, getting the classroom to all listen and engage in what you want them to be doing because you have got this direction you want them to be heading in, you end up using strategies that don't feel comfortable. I would say I was on the softer end of things. I certainly wasn't much of a shouter. I wasn't a big fan of reward or detention systems because I could see from the outset they didn't really work, although I didn't have the words or understanding for why they didn't work then.
Mhm.
And I think it's once you dive into why these things aren't working, for me, the natural conclusion was home education, because in a mass education setting, it's really, really hard to function without them because it's almost impossible to control a huge group of people doing something that they haven't chosen to do and they don't want to do.
Right, right. It's that buy-in that is so critical to any learning. And if they're
Hmm.
just being told, "Go here, do this," you have no say so. Obviously, like you said, they're acting they're responding to a situation that all of us, even adults included, would say, "Excuse me, I think I don't like it here." But
Yeah.
we're requiring them to do it. How many kids are you talking about in your classroom too? I forgot to ask you that part.
So it varied, but mostly it was between, I'd say, 25 to 30
Yeah,
in
that's a
the
lot.
vast majority of lessons. There would be the occasional one that would be smaller, but they were few and far between.
Okay. And when you say you were saying A-level math for England, is this like would this be the equivalent of maybe like algebra, geometry, calculus,
I think
trigonometry, things like
so,
that?
yeah.
Okay.
So for us, GCSE is not optional. So this is also a big sort of thing for me, and even wasn't as a teacher. There are certain subjects that are optional, but maths and English and science, although it varies in what format it's delivered and you have to take exams in, they are non-optional. Everyone has to do them, and everyone has to go to those lessons, and they are priorities. They've given a lot of timetable time, whereas other subjects are optional. So that's up to GCSE, which you take at 16. And some students will take a foundation maths GCSE and some will take higher. Once they've taken that exam, everything is optional from there. So
Mm,
A level maths is optional for those that want to take maths further. So it would start with calculus. It's roughly at that sort of stage.
okay. Okay, that makes sense then. Well, so once you recognized that that was an unnatural environment for you, and then you also noticed that of course, you're part of the pandemic transition. There were so many families who, during the pandemic, realized this is not working, and once they were home, noticed that their kids were thriving and happier. So,
Mhm.
once you made that shift, what would you say kind of like helped you jump back into teaching math in that more joyful way? It seems like it was always there for you, but then, you got inspired to share that message with the world through an Instagram page. What do you hope to get out of that with the families that you're sharing this information with?
So I from the get-go of home education, I started doing one-to-one tuition with students from local schools. I'm quite well known in the area because I taught in the area for such a long time. And I really enjoyed working one-to-one with students because I could give them my full attention and adapt to their exact needs.
Mhm.
And the amount of times students would say, or I tend to call them clients rather than students because I feel like it's more of a mutual relationship that way.
Yeah.
They would say like nobody's understood my brain like you before or explained it in that way before, and I don't think that that was the case that nobody else could explain it like that. But I feel like a big part of it was listening and
Mm.
actually listening to what they were saying and taking the time to fully understand where they were coming from. And I find that one of the most enjoyable parts of teaching and engaging with young people in maths is actually me trying to work out how to communicate it effectively so that they can visualize it. And visually, it's a huge part of maths is visualizing the maths and it actually being a very visual and physical subject.
Yeah.
So I wanted to move from there into, I wanted to support more home educating families. One-to-one tuition is quite expensive for people. And also it is quite challenging if it's online. I find it much easier face to face doing this sort of work. So I was trying to translate that into something that would be more accessible for home educating families. And I we personally unschool. So I started coming at it from an unschooling perspective of what if you looked at maths totally differently? And so the unschooling took me to thinking about deschooling and questioning maths. And my understanding of deschooling is questioning something and whether it actually works for you and your family or not. So if it's working, then it's fine.
Mhm.
But if it's not, why is it not? And how can we make it work for us? So I started doing that with maths and started thinking about how I could help families make it work for them. And that's when I decided, instead of, because initially I was under unschooling maths, but decided actually it's not necessarily about telling people I want them to approach maths in a particular way. It's about supporting them with where they are in maths and trying to make it work for them in the way they want it to work for them.
That's great. Yeah. Well, and you said a couple things too about when you were working one on one, and the fact that you could actually listen to the students and to the kids. I found that to be 100% true every time I worked with kids one on one or in small groups, is that you really do get that chance to have a back and forth, where when you're in the class setting, you as a teacher are charged with going through a curriculum, and you have a timeline
Mhm.
that you're working up against, and you have an expectation put on you. So you don't really have the ability to customize in the way that you want to for all the individual kids, especially if you've got 25 or 30 kids that you're working with. Um, and then I think that that system tends to make students get lost in the shuffle. Number one, some of them may want to ask questions, but they feel either too shy or maybe they just don't want to bother. And there's a lot of information that goes over people's heads. And this one on one ability or even small groups is absolutely, I think, the best way to teach particular subjects, especially something like math, where there really does need to be that back and forth, that communication. So when you talk about it through the unschooling lens, and I will say, just from my perspective, I have a master's in special education. And so one of the things that I did while I was in the schools is I did a lot of personalized, customized plans for kids. And then while I was doing those, I remember thinking, why are we not doing this for everybody? Like, why do we have to have a kid who has to have all this documentation to prove that they need to have this specialized plan,
Mm.
when in fact what we're doing would make more sense for every kid that comes into school. And so, that's when my wheels were turning back when I was still in the classroom setting, way before I even had kids. And then of course, once we got into the homeschooling world, it was clear how quickly kids would pick things up when you were able to just have a conversation. And when it comes to math, I know there are calculations and there's rules and there are things in order that you are to do things, but I've found that it truly is a language just like the English language, and it can be taught in a story format. Um, so walk us through kind of what you do with your own kids and also other kids that you work with. Like, how do you have a particular way that you approach math if you find that somebody's kind of hesitant or nervous, or maybe even coming to you already feeling like they're just not capable?
Absolutely. I'd like, if I can, I'd like to go back and pick up on what you said about like special educational needs
Yeah.
and this Taylor plan. I've been asked recently, actually, about specific ways to approach maths for children with special educational needs and neurodivergence, and I
Mhm.
essentially answered in a very similar way to what you just said. Is that I can list off like a whole bunch of ideas, but I feel like that's what I would do for everyone. And you would tailor it to what they need and what they want. With my own children, they are only 5 and 7,
Okay.
and I literally just respond to questions and whatever comes up for them. My son came at maths like, I how could I say it? Very, very quickly
Mhm.
and enthusiastically. He's absolutely obsessed with Lego, and a lot of it has come from there. So even I think he was 4. It was before I'd finished teaching. He came to me one day with a massive, I mean, really massively long vehicle that made, telling me he'd noticed that they always have to have an even number of wheels, and essentially recited the 2 times table to me.
Oh my gosh.
He didn't know what he was talking about. He knew, he spotted there was a pattern, and he spotted that it always had to follow this rule, and it just come from Lego, and
Mhm.
times tables have come from Lego, and games with him as well, because spotting arrays on the top of Lego, so the how many dots are going across and down, and talking about how some of them have got the same number of dots, but they're a different shape, essentially. Symmetry is a big one. He went through a real fascination with building symmetrical objects and noticing that when he was following instructions, a lot of them are symmetrical. And now we're going through a whole development in number sense. And we were playing a game the other day, and he was talking me through how he was adding up his score, and how I think it was one where he had to add 12 onto something, and I was expecting him to add 10 and 2, but he actually noticed it was easier to. I think he did. Did he take 2 off his score? He noticed something about his score where he could pair them together much easier, and I was absolutely fascinated by it. And he spotted that he was going through the 5 times table at one point and things like that. And he genuinely just finds very, like, pattern spotting, numbers, things like that, really interesting. Negative numbers came up because he spotted them on our fridge, and we had a handful of conversations over a few weeks where he came back sometimes a few times in a day, sometimes a few days later, asking me about getting further away from 0, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't use much formal sort of maths language with them, although I have started introducing some to him when he's shown interest in it. And we do go to something called Yurt School on a Wednesday, which is a community group, and there have been more formal maths there, where there was some like adding and subtracting, where he knew how to add and subtract, but he'd never like used the symbols before. But because he'd done so much of it like mentally, he just threw himself into it.
Mm-hmm.
My daughter she's not so into physical stuff and things like that. So I was expecting this all to go a bit slower, but she hit 5 and numbers just seemed to light up for her. Really interested in adding things together. And I think everyone I talk to with more than one kid has gone through that phase of, when I'm this age, how old will my brother be? And when my
Right.
brother's
Yeah.
this age, and like working out that gap repeatedly and things like that, and just developing that number sense. And I just plan to do that for as long as it works for them, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And if it stops working, we'll change and do something different. And I
Yeah.
feel really comfortable with that
No,
at the moment.
it's so funny you said that about the Lego thing. I've heard that story so many times, and that was absolutely true in our family too. And my son was probably about 3-ish when he got his first Lego set, and then about 4, he put together this pretty elaborate set. And I thought it was I mean, of course, I thought it was so cute because he would call it constructions instead of instructions. And I was
My
like,
son does that too,
no
yeah.
way. I'm like, that's so
Yeah.
cute because it's perfect, right? It is a construction, like you were
Yeah.
making something. And so, but yeah, no, Legos were huge in our house. And when you were saying the thing about how they notice patterns and shapes and order, and that was the case for us too with Minecraft, because Minecraft, as you are aware, is an online game, and the
Mhm.
kids would have to build things. And in order to build, you had this little grid that you had to utilize, and you had to put things in the grid that would then convert into the tool that they were creating. And then when you build on the world, you have to build in a pattern and a like a block shape. So there were so many ways that living and playing and interacting created this connection with them about numbers and how numbers work in the world. And it wasn't isolated into a classroom setting, or even sitting at the table. Like some homeschool might be a little bit more structured in that way, but it was so lived. It was a lived experience with these numbers and patterns. And I noticed that when we would build with blocks, or build with puzzles, or mazes, there were so many different ways that numbers and patterns came into our life. My son was huge into Pokemon as well, and that's where he
Yeah.
started really connecting and calculating, because he would add numbers together and subtract numbers for for the attack points, that he had to use for his
Absolutely.
Pokemon. Um,
My son seems to be on the same trajectory as your
oh
son,
gosh, is he
very
getting ready
much
to the
so.
Pokemon world is about to
We
explode?
we're deep in Pokemon and Minecraft
Yeah.
currently. And Minecraft has been like one of the things that blew me away is the 3D coordinates on there.
Mhm.
And my husband just stuck his fingers in so your thumb's pointing up, your first finger pointing forward, and then your middle finger pointing towards the side to represent the three axes, and explained to him that one was for moving forwards and backwards, one for right and left, one for up and down, and showed him how it related to the numbers. And he just went, "Oh, right." And like it just sort of clicked. And I
Uh-huh.
know that in secondary school, that's like not approached until you're well, you have to be doing higher GCSE to even come across it. And it just seemed insane that he was at the age of 6, just like, yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah. Right, right. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, and especially when they're doing it in service to some goal they've already set, it's amazing how quick that information can be absorbed because they're already kind of
Mm.
primed for it. Um, well, what kind of advice would you offer to parents who have young kids? I mean, you've already mentioned what you're doing with your kids, but what other sort of things would you suggest that they do to ensure that their children are sort of getting familiar with numbers and the number sense? Is there anything,
So
you would suggest?
yeah, so there's sort of I was thinking of it actually the other day, how I sort of mentally split maths up, and I say I start off with like exploring and using very physical things and having lots of physical resources that the children can just grab, and I find that really important, that it's something that they can just access, and then number sense sort of develops from there. And I've read a lot about games and playing board games being really important.
Mhm.
I'm not a massive board game fan. My husband's much better at that, so we do play some, but it's not like a huge thing in our household. But I think for people that enjoy that, that's brilliant for number sense. And if nothing else, like what motivates you more than keeping score?
Right?
Um, and then, the other thing with number sense, I think, is just thinking about different ways to do calculations. So even just a conversation about, so say adding to make 10, thinking about how many different ways you can do it. So
Mhm.
rather than just sort of like 4 plus 6, for example, makes 10, is there other things that make 10 as well? Because there's actually infinite different ways to make 10, and you can get as complicated as you would like with that question. You can take it into decimals, fractions, negatives. You can take it as far as anyone's interested in it.
Mhm.
But just thinking about how you can do things multiple ways is a really interesting one to develop number sense.
Right.
And then with multiplication in particular, looking at patterns. So looking at patterns in times tables, but also, for example, if you wanted to multiply something by 19, exploring how you could do 10, multiply it by 10 and multiply it by 9. You could multiply it by 20 and take one away. And you know what I mean? Like looking at those easy ways around it, so that you're
Mhm.
not you're using like you're using your knowledge of number to actually make the calculation easier. There's a lot of research done by Joe Bowler, has done a lot of research and collated research on how number sense is often a really good gauge for being successful at maths later on in life, because you're actually using your brain more efficiently, essentially.
Right. That's so funny you mentioned her because I actually and I think, I told you before you started recording, I was working on this math guide and I've quoted her in it. And
Yeah.
I wrote it down and she was kind of debunking the idea that you have a math brain and that you're born with a
Hmm.
math brain, because the idea that, and I think some people do fall into that belief system of, well, I'm not good at this, therefore I don't have a quote unquote math brain. I mean, I feel like just what I've witnessed is that there is um a tendency for people to be more attracted maybe to numbers and kind of like to manipulate them. And then some
Mhm.
people might be more attracted to words and writing, but it doesn't mean that they're not capable of doing both. It just might be that they tend to lean that way first. I will say, like with my son and my daughter, he was definitely more number oriented and she
Mm.
was more letter oriented. So he would play with numbers and write numbers and ask about numbers around the same age frame where she was saying, "Can show me how to write the letter A? I want to," and she would sit in the back of the car with a little notepad and just write letters over and over and over again, you know? So I thought that was
Yeah.
really interesting in comparing the two of them and the experience that they had. But also being a teacher, I noticed that there were certain kids that would just tend to want to manipulate numbers and play around with them. And like you said before about the 10, making the 10, how they would almost want to take a multiple different numbers and like add them together and subtract them and exponents and all that kind of stuff and divide, and it was like a game. It was a fun game for them, and it just seemed to be something they gravitated towards. So what do you think as far as like your experience about somebody being maybe more math inclined than someone else, or do you think it really is just about maybe where they are in their development and that
Yeah.
you know
If I can pick up on a couple of things you said, I think I've observed very similar things for my own son and daughter. And I was listening to a podcast the other day. Um, I can't remember who the guest was, but the host is Rangan Chatterjee, who's a GP in the UK. So he's a doctor, but he interviews lots of people about health and well-being, and talking about there being a big difference within the brain of people born male, people born female, and how people that are born female have a much more complicated connectivity of communication.
mm,
And I observe that in my daughter as well. But linked to maths, I don't think that makes her any less mathematical than my son or mathematically inclined. Obviously, they're very young and we'll see how they develop. I think Jo Bowler would agree with me on this. I love her for the fact that she often gives me research and words for things I have observed myself. That the curriculum in England, and I believe in many, many countries, is so incredibly narrow. It makes us think of maths as this really narrow area. And
mm,
particularly in primary school, it reduces it down to almost numeracy and a bit of shape and space, when it's actually a very broad and rich and interesting subject. And I feel that somebody that says they don't feel they're very good at maths, potentially it could just be they've had a bad experience. There's a lot of evidence, a lot of research around maths trauma and it being a genuine issue, in that there's so much negativity around maths, particularly if you are essentially not male, not white, or not Asian, as in like Chinese Asian.
mhm.
But if you're not of those descents, there's a lot of negativity around maths, and also that people just don't see the different areas you can be good at. So a good example actually is myself and my husband. So I love abstract maths. I really love all the abstract, airy fairy, theoretical side of things. It's where my heart was at university, and I've always dived into algebra without even a full understanding. I just loved it. Whereas my husband is very into applying things. Now, he is by trade a fabricator and welder, but
Mm.
he's retrained recently because he had an issue with his hands. And he actually has ended up teaching maths to apprentices, and teaching fabricating and welding to them. And he had, from having a very basic qualification in maths, 20 plus years on from taking that qualification, he's had to teach himself. So A level, which is like the top you would see at high school, and even some of the lower degree level maths, he had to teach himself to get through this course. And he absolutely aced it. And from what I can see, part of it was that he has a huge wealth of real life experience in using and applying maths to what he did every day, because he was having to uh, work out things to do with heat, to do with bending to circumferences, to getting exact angles. He was constantly applying maths practically all the time. And another part of it was that he actually was interested. Like, he knew that this maths was going to take him on to something else that he really wanted to do. And that was a huge difference to where he was 20 years ago. And the two of us are wildly different. We
Mm-hmm.
have, he would never have said he was a maths person before. And yet I would actually advise somebody that was looking to apply maths to a real life setting to go to him over me the majority of the time, because his brain just goes there so much easier than mine does. And
Interesting. Yeah, that's really cool. Well, you know, when you were talking and you said something about him going back to learn some things or to, uh, I guess, pick up on some skills maybe that he needed to refresh himself on, it made me think of gaps in our knowledge. And I know that you had a post related to that. And I want to talk about that a little bit because I do think that there's this weird idea that you are going to be from A to Z completely knowledgeable in all things math
mm,
if you go to school. And if you don't go to school, you're going to have all these gaps and you're going to be behind and all the language of sort of kind of a negative bent. And you know, I kind of wanted to touch on that a little bit and sort of get your opinion on how to help any parent who is curious about homeschooling, or even if they have kids in school. You know, what would you say to them about the gap idea?
so I think in school, we have this sort of thought, I suppose, or illusion, maybe that's a harsh word for it, that there's no gaps in knowledge because the curriculum has been covered.
Mm,
And even if your child has never missed a lesson, you can't guarantee they've learned everything because they've been there. In England, there's definitely a push and a focus on evidence. Like, we can evidence everything somebody knows, but it's just not possible.
mm-mm.
Like, and I know from 11 years in a classroom, just because something's written down in a book and somebody did it doesn't mean they've remembered it or they've learnt it. It isn't evidence for anything. And gaps in knowledge are normal. Like, nobody can know everything. There's this amazing mathematician in the UK called Marcus de Sotoy, who does a lot of work on the BBC on the telly, and he talks about how mathematicians, he is a professional mathematician as well, spend 90% of their life going wrong because they're trying to learn new things. And obviously they'll have huge gaps because they've specialized into an area. There's no way to specialize into every single element and aspect of maths.
Yeah,
And then they learn the bits they need as they need them to utilize them.
right.
So I think one part of it is that you can't guarantee, just because somebody has told you something or shown you something, that it's known and learnt and it's securely there. But the other part is that the assumption that the curriculum covers everything that we
Yeah.
need, which I also don't believe to be true. I just think the idea that we can cram everything we need into somebody's brain by the time they're 16 to 18 is absolutely ludicrous. A lot
Mhm.
of We won't even know what jobs that they'll be doing in the future. And I
Right.
think
No, I
the
agree.
last yeah, and the last one, I really think this is a big one that people don't admit to necessarily, is that when they're asking about this, I think they're talking about doing it on a time frame. They're saying, what if they want to have passed their GCSE by 16? Will they have gaps in their knowledge?
Yeah.
Well, the answer is yes. If you've not covered everything that's on that course by the time they're 16, they've got gaps for that course.
Yeah.
So if they want to have done that by the time they're 16, yes, you have to cover that exact stuff by the time they're 16. But that qualification is not going anywhere if you haven't covered it by that age. You
Mhm.
just, they can cover it later on when they need it, and they can sit that exam or take that qualification at that point. So I suppose they're my three sort of issues with gaps, is that I just don't believe anyone doesn't have any gaps. I don't believe the curriculum covers everything or could ever cover anything. And I don't think you need to do things on these tight timeframes or schedules that have sort of been laid out as the norm for us.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Gosh, I know. I mean, that's one of the probably the biggest messages I hammered to home to both of my children is that this timeline that we are operating under, that the school systems have given us, is arbitrary. And we have to recognize that, yes, if you want to do it in a certain time frame, then there's a template that's set up and you can roll through that template. But if you want to just take your time and absorb things and allow your interest to sort of lead you, and then also create a goal and then work backwards and figure out what you need to do to get to that goal, then I think it sticks more because it's
Mm.
meaningful and you are
Yeah.
also primed for it. And I will say, personal experience for our situation is that, I was not, as a, like I told you, I was a trained teacher. And so when I first started homeschooling, I thought that it was going to look a certain way. And I was going to have all this information, and I was going to organize stuff, and I was going to hand it to my son, and he was going to happily do it and just roll through all the things I created. And of course he was like, no. and, and I was like, what is going on? I'm a teacher. Why is he not listening to me? And it's because I changed who I was. I was no longer his mom. I mean, I was mom, but I was not mom as I had been. It was all of a sudden like I just put my teacher hat on and became this person who came to him sort of like, here are the things you need to do now. And he was sort of like, why? We've been having so much fun up to now. Why all of a sudden do you want me to sit down at a table? And so all that to say is he, of course, kind of put the mirror up to me to be like, no, you need to stop. And then, his sister became 100% unschooled from the get-go because he helped me kind of get out of my own way and get out of his way too. But we just lived and learned throughout all of their years. And when he was ready to get, as some people say, more serious about math, he sat down and he picked it up so quickly. And I know somebody's written something. I read it a while ago and I wish I could find exactly who said it, or even if there was research to back it up. But there's something along the lines of like, if you want to learn math and you haven't technically taken all the classes in the correct order as school lays out, you could potentially learn everything you need to learn in like 6 to 8 weeks or something like that if you were just studying, kind of every day. And I was like,
Yeah.
well, that's interesting. But I also have seen it, and I've seen kids who, when they're ready, it's like they sit down and they go, okay, this makes sense. And I think part of that is because of, number one, they're older, their brains are more mature. Number two, they've lived and moved and used things, and they've been very physical throughout their lives, right? They've played and they've
Hmm.
interacted. And so they have a bigger knowledge base. So when it's time for them to sit down and really zone in and hone in on math, then they have all this information and a very strong foundation on which to build. And so it makes more sense. Um, so I always come from the math idea of like, not stressing yourself out when the children are younger by thinking you have to do it in a very specific, almost inflexible order, but allow
Hmm.
it to be very playful, like you were saying earlier about making it very physical. And I will just put a little plug in there as a physical, as in literally holding it in your hand, because
Hmm.
yes, the online stuff, I'm not against that at all. And I think it is fun, but I do think there's something different about taking an item and holding it and counting it and moving it in your hand
Yeah.
versus virtually.
Absolutely. There is a cognitive leap to go from physical to visual, and then visual to abstract. And I would say anything online is more visual than physical, if that makes sense. And
Mhm.
again, not to discredit it, But yeah, it's not the same as physically holding something, for sure.
Right, right. Well, I was going to tell you, I have these two books in front of me right now, and these are books that I have been working my way through. And one of them is called Innumeracy, Mathematical Illiteracy and Its Consequences. And it's written by this guy named John Allen Paulos. I didn't know him until I ran across this book. But what I appreciate about it is that at the very beginning, he talks about 4 or 5 big misconceptions about math. And I was just going to read this one because I feel like we've touched on this a little bit. Um, but I think it's important to share with people regarding math and the misconceptions. So it says the first and most pernicious of these misconceptions is that mathematics is nothing more than computation. The truth is that in many areas of the subject, mathematics has as much to do with computation as writing has to do with typing. And you mentioned that, earlier about the fact that it's not just about putting numbers together and making calculations. It's so much bigger and more diverse and more beautiful than that. Um,
Yeah.
so what other things would you suggest to parents? Well, you know what?
Yeah.
Actually, well, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. What came up for you?
So there is something about having number sense and having a good sense of number and being able to do calculations, because it gives you that sense of pattern and connectivity. But I think most mathematicians would just use a calculator. like and I've read a lot of books that suggest most people that take maths at degree level or beyond are often your slower to calculate people, which I've only just realized. I've always been quite slow to calculate things, and I just thought I was an oddity. I didn't realize that that was actually a bit of a thing. And that actually maths requires deep thinkers, because often maths is about solving problems. And when employers are looking for mathematical skills, we get a lot of feedback in the UK about employers being disappointed about people's mathematical skills.
Hmm.
And I think what they're really meaning is that they're disappointed in their ability to look at a problem and pull it apart and try to work to a solution, because that's not what the curriculum encourages or aims to teach or figure out at all. And I think a lot of maths is essentially that. There's a problem in front of us. How can we figure it out? How can we work out a way to solve it? Now, for me, that's often, as I said, I'm really into the abstract side of things. So that can often involve, I use a lot of diagrams, a lot of pictures. I don't think I ever solve anything without drawing something,
Mm.
and a lot of algebra. For my husband, it would often involve actually physically doing something, actually physically picking something up and trying to. He spends a lot of time measuring stuff. We have tape measures everywhere. My kids like pick them up all the time. So I think I personally think it needs to come from a person's interest. If somebody is super into number and algebra, and they are sort of like along my lines of things, like by all means find traditional problems, or or non-traditional problems, but like ones that look a bit more schooly, I suppose, and let them just play with it. But let them play with it. I wouldn't worry about doing it in a particular way, about it looking tidy, about getting to a correct answer. I firmly believe, when I reflect on my own childhood, the fact that nobody realised I was particularly good at maths for a long time did me a huge service, because I was left under the radar to just play and work things out for myself.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then if they are not showing much interest in stuff like that, I think a lot of it comes down to trust, and trust that within what they are interested in, the right maths will come up for them. And because they need it and want to solve the problem or apply it to what they're doing, then there will be that desire to research it and learn it. And they may need some support and guidance and help in doing that, by all means. I'm not suggesting they have to do everything independently.
Right.
But if they need something more formal, they can do that at any point. I think it just has to come up in their interest. Now, that doesn't mean like, I'm not trying to say you'll observe something and miraculously Pythagoras theorem will pop out at you. Like if they need Pythagoras theorem, I fully think you should say, oh, this would really help you solve that. I
Mm-hmm.
don't,
Right.
because actually coming up with Pythagoras theorem would be really, really hard.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just saying that if it doesn't apply to what they're doing, I just don't think there's a need for it,
Yeah.
and
It's
that
not like
it
we're
won't stop them doing it later on.
Yeah, it's not like we're trying to um keep things from our kids, you know? It's not this is not about them being completely left to their own devices and being independent, as you were saying, or just even neglected in a way of it's about allowing their interests to lead the way, but also being very upfront and honest about the fact that if you wanted to have a bank account, you might want to know how money works, you know?
Mm.
And so we're going to talk to them about the tools that they need and help them become competent and autonomous in their in their learning and in the ways that they set their goals and um kind of the trajectory of whatever the direction they're going. So um I wanted to talk to you too about the thing you have on your Instagram page, your Revive Math with CPR. So
Mhm.
what do you mean by that? And how
So
did you get
my
there?
long-term plan is to actually do a course for parents called Revive Maths, where I can offer a, a sort of wealth of knowledge about different approaches to maths and deschooling maths and a whole range of things. But it's basically my ethos. It's where I pull everything from. So I think a huge part of maths, for me in particular, but I think it's missed out, is the creativity in maths. The fact that you can think outside the box, that you can go wrong a whole bunch of times, and asking questions and exploring it and noticing. I did a podcast with Sonia Post recently, and she does notice and wonder. I think that's a fabulous idea of it. Just
Mhm.
noticing what's there and wondering about it. And then another side is real life maths. So the CPR is creative thinking, problem solving in real life. So real life, I think, is the more sort of grounding sense of what do you practically need in real life, but also what we talked about with physical, using actual physical objects. So you can see in real life what is happening. And then the other bit is problem solving, which is a bit I absolutely love. So I talked about that quite a lot already, with like how you could do physical problems, but also sort of more abstract problems as well. And I just think, for me, they're the sort of key areas that bring maths alive and make it more interesting and exciting and engaging for everyone.
Yeah, that's great. So you said this is a course you are hoping to put together eventually,
It
or
is,
okay.
but yeah, I want to build up to it, so I'm going to offer out a couple of smaller things first, and build up towards that maybe later in the year or early next year.
That's great.
I'll,
I know that'll be really well received, you know, because I feel like one of the things I did want to kind of highlight regarding teaching our kids at home is that we don't have to do it all by ourselves. You know,
mm-hmm,
it's not meant to be you alone with your children 24/7. It's meant to be we're creating the environment so that learning is about the individual's interest and kind of the guiding principle and the light that want to keep lit for them. And
yeah,
so when it comes to particular subject areas, some parents I think bow out of the idea of homeschooling because they think, oh, well, I'm terrible at math.
mm.
So for families or parents who feel that way, what's some advice you can offer to them to sort of like reduce their stress and find the joy in math again?
I would start off. I would never say I'm terrible at maths. I
Mhm,
think
right?
it's
I
like a
know, I know. Don't say
there's
it.
Yeah, no, and there's evidence and research to say that mums to daughters and female teachers to female students, it has a genuine negative impact on the daughters and the students' own progress in maths.
Wow.
Um, but it has a negative impact on anyone, but they're particularly susceptible. Um, so yeah, I think you can be super honest about your experience in maths and your feelings without saying I'm bad at it. So you
Yeah.
could say I need more time to do that. I find that really challenging. I had a bad experience at school with maths, so it's not my favorite thing to do. You can say all those things without saying I'm bad at maths, if that
Right.
makes sense. Or
Right.
there's yeah. So I think that's a real key one. And the other thing is, so I do loads of art with my children. Nobody is ever going to buy something I have produced so far. Let's be positive about this. But so far, nobody's paying any money for it. But it doesn't stop me diving in and doing it with them every single time. And I am super confident that my kids do way more art stuff and explore and experiment more because I do it with them. And I really firmly believe that with maths too, that you don't have to be the expert. You can be alongside your child all the time, and that they will love that and really relish it and enjoy it. I don't, in fact, I would go as far as saying them looking to you as an expert could even be a bit of a hindrance, because it could feel like that sort of pressure to perform and do. We've got this whole perfectionism thing on this whole right or wrong thing about maths, haven't we? Everything's right or it's wrong. I've had that said to me so many times. Marking for maths must be so easy because it's right or it's wrong. And I just think that's so not true. And I always go back to the example of adding fractions, because it frustrated me so much as a teacher when students didn't get marks in exams for getting the correct answer for adding fractions. And it's so complicated, and they can do so much of it right and not get the right answer. And
Mm.
I think that is a really bad message to give, that you can do so much of a process correctly and have some good understanding of it without having got the right answer, if that makes sense.
Oh,
So I
no,
think,
that makes so much sense, and that's such a great point to highlight too, because it isn't just, um, there is a process, and it takes time to get there, and so there should be some recognition of that for kids, and if they did technically get the wrong answer while they were working through it, then I think the best thing to do would be just to go back and say, "All right, well, let's look at your process and see maybe where things went off the rails a little bit or where you got confused," versus just saying
yeah,
it's wrong and move on.
yeah, and also just that, just I'll often say to my, even something that's really blatantly wrong, like my son, we were playing a game the other day and he was adding up some scores, and there was two numbers he told me he was adding together, and I didn't agree with the answer. And I think I said either I didn't say anything or I said, "Oh, I got a different answer." And
Mhm,
it's, rather than sort of saying you're right, wrong, and I'm right, it sort of gives that very different tone of just, oh, we've got different answers to each other,
mhm.
and we could explore that if we want to, or we cannot,
Yeah,
and that's okay. And it gives them sort of the option to decide, if that makes sense.
mhm.
And I think that yeah, I really think the whole right or wrong thing is a big one. And I really, really would encourage parents to spend a long time reflecting on their own maths experience and deschooling maths. I actually wrote a guide called Reboot Maths, which is totally free off my Instagram, um, of taking you through like a reflection process, um, where you look at questioning whether maths is serving you and your family, or whether it's not, and questioning how you could change habits within your family to make it serve you better. And
That's
I think
wonderful.
that's really valuable for people.
Yeah,
And
and you
it's certainly what I've done myself as well.
I'm so sorry. Say that again.
I said it's certainly what I've done myself as well.
Yes. Yeah. It helps to take some time to reflect on our own past and kind of understand why we feel the way we do about certain subjects or ideas. And, because sometimes until you sit and really kind of bring it forward and make it conscious, you kind of operate on an autopilot. And then, you may even be repeating things that you were told when you were a kid. And then one day you might go, wait a minute, I don't really believe that. I don't think that's true. So yeah, I do think there's something very valuable in sitting quietly and thinking things through. So you said the guide you have available is Reboot Math. Is that correct?
Reboot, yeah.
Reboot. Okay.
REBOOT. And if you go to my Instagram or TikTok, there's like a link to I think it's called Stand Store, and it's just on there. You can just download it for free.
Okay, good. I'll make sure I put a link to that in the show notes because I want to make sure everybody can get to it. So is there anything else that you want to add that maybe we didn't touch on or I forgot to ask you? I'm trying to think. I'm looking at my list of questions and I'm like, I think let me just say this. Here's what I know. We touched on gaps. We touched on fear. We touched on math being much more than just calculation. We touched on that idea of it being a process. And what was the other thing I wanted to? Oh, we talked about Revive math with CPR, and of course, we talked about your history. And is there anything else you can think of that we might want to encourage
There's
parents
nothing
with?
else. No, nothing I can specifically think of that I can. No.
Okay. Well, and I just want to encourage everybody to remember that it is a growth mindset. It's not about doing it all in the first couple of years or even the first 12 years. It's more like just allow it to be a process that is you're evolving and growing and adding to. And it's not something that you have to know everything about before you graduate high school or be of age 18. And there's nothing that really is that way. I mean, I'm learning all the time and I'm 52. So, you never stop
Yeah,
learning.
yeah, absolutely. I feel like the last 3 years have been some of the biggest learning points of my entire life. It's been an incredible process.
I agree. I've joked before about that with my kids. I'm like, oh my gosh, homeschooling my kids has allowed me to be the most ultimate student because when
Yeah.
they're into something and then they're kind of done with it, I'm like, no, I'm taking this book and I'm going to go over here and read the rest of it, And so it really has allowed me to just continue to be curious and dive into things. And I think that's wonderful. I love it.
Yeah, me too.
Well, thank you so much, Ruth, for being here today and bringing all your experience and wisdom to us about math. And I just want to encourage everyone to check you out on Instagram. And you said you have TikTok as well?
I do, yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much, Missy.
Thank you for listening. To learn more about guests on the podcast and to stay up to date on how they are showing up to make the world a better place for children and families, please check the show notes. To become a part of the great educational awakening and to keep up with my latest writings, offerings, and workshops, be sure you're signed up for my Substack newsletter. You can also follow along on social media at Let 'em Go Barefoot. That's LETEMGO Barefoot. If you are new to homeschooling, new to unschooling, or are simply unschooling curious but not sure where to start, we now have a beautiful 43-page downloadable guide that walks you through the how and why of self-directed education and child-led learning, as well as responses to common questions and concerns around academics, motivation, college, community, and more. You can find a link to purchase your copy in the show notes. Thank you so much for your support. As always, stay curious, stay connected, and stay aware. Until next time.